The sun was setting slowly over the verdant hills of rural Montana, bathing the old wooden house in an orange glow that masked its weathered appearance. Sarah watched through the kitchen window as she washed the lunch dishes, her brown eyes reflecting a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. She was only 32, but the marks of a difficult life were already etched into every line of her face. The house creaked with the wind, as if it too sighed with exhaustion. Located miles from the nearest town, it was surrounded only by open fields and a small copse of trees at the back. For many, such a landscape would represent freedom. For Sarah, it was her open-air prison. "Sarah, where's my coffee?" Robert's voice echoed from the living room, making her stiffen instantly. "I'm just finishing up," she responded in an almost inaudible tone, hurrying to prepare the beverage exactly as he liked it, strong, with 2 spoonfuls. Of sugar, no more, no less. Robert was a man of few words and much harshness. Tall, with broad shoulders and hands calloused from working the land, he imposed his presence with a simple glance. His eyes, a dull green, rarely showed anything other than discontent, especially when directed at his wife. Sarah entered the living room carrying the coffee cup. Robert was sitting in his favorite armchair, leafing through an old newspaper. He didn't look up when she placed the coffee on the small table beside him. "I need to go into town tomorrow," he said, still without looking at her. "I want the blue shirt ironed." "Yes, Robert," she responded automatically. When she turned to leave, he grabbed her wrist forcefully, making her freeze in place. "And I don't want any funny business while I'm gone. Understand?" Sarah nodded, feeling the grip on her wrist intensify before finally being released. She returned to the kitchen with quick steps, her heart racing. This would be her chance. Robert rarely went to town, and when he did, he returned the same day. But this time, he had mentioned that he needed to resolve issues about selling part of the property, which might keep him away longer. The idea of escape wasn't new. It had been silently germinating in her mind for years, but fear always spoke, louder. Where would she go? How would she survive? And mainly, what would happen if Robert found her? When she finished her kitchen chores, Sarah walked to the stable behind the property. Twilight was already giving way to night, and the first stars dotted the sky. The familiar smell of hay and wood greeted her, bringing a momentary sense of peace. "Hi, Chestnut," she whispered, approaching the stall where her horse rested. The imposing reddish-brown animal raised its head at the sound of her voice, its intelligent eyes fixed on her. Chestnut was her only true friend in that isolated place. A gift from her father when she was just 15, the horse had been with her ever since, a silent witness to everything she had lived through. When Robert entered her life, charming her parents with promises of a stable life for their daughter, the horse was the only thing she was able to take with her. "Tomorrow he'll be gone," Sarah spoke softly, stroking the animal's nose. "Maybe. It's our chance." Chestnut whinnied gently as if understanding every word. Sarah rested her forehead against his, allowing the tears she had held back all day to finally fall. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching made her quickly step back and dry her face. "Talking to that animal again?" asked Robert, standing. At the entrance to the stable, a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. "People will think you're really crazy." "I just came to check if he had water," Sarah justified, avoiding his gaze. Robert grunted, disinterested. "Don't be long, it's getting cold." When he walked away, Sarah took a deep breath. She stroked Chestnut once more before whispering, "Tomorrow, my friend. Tomorrow maybe we can finally be free." Back at the house, as she prepared dinner, her gaze fixed on the back door. Out there, beyond Robert's land, there was an entire world, a world she barely knew, but which couldn't be worse than the one in which she lived. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow could be the beginning of a new life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. Dawn had not yet given way today when Robert was already up. Sarah prepared his breakfast in silence, moving through the kitchen like a shadow while he checked some documents spread across the table. The plan was to leave right after sunrise. "I'll be back tomorrow night at the latest," he said, closing the worn leather portfolio where he kept his papers. I want the house in order when I get back, and don't forget to feed the animals." Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes lowered. Part of her wanted to believe he would take longer, perhaps 2 or 3 days, enough time for her to escape and be far away when he returned. But reality was different. Robert never stayed away for very long. "Don't go inventing excuses to wander around," he added, adjusting his hat on his head. His eyes pierced hers, as if they could read her thoughts. "That brother of yours showed up in town last week asking about you. I told him you were too busy for visitors." Sarah felt her heart race. Her brother, Michael, was the only family. She had left since her parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. Robert always did everything to keep them apart, claiming that Michael was a bad influence, that he only wanted to take advantage of them. "I understand," she replied, hiding the emotion in her voice. Knowing that Michael still cared about her brought a point of light into her darkness. When she finally heard the engine of Robert's car rumbling on the dirt road, moving away, Sarah allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time that day. The house, previously oppressive, seemed momentarily lighter without his presence. After quickly finishing the household chores, she decided to clean the living room floor. Not because it needed it, but because she needed to occupy her hands while her mind worked on the escape plan. As she vigorously scrubbed the wooden boards, she noticed something strange. One of them creaked and moved differently from the others. Curious, Sarah pressed her fingers to the edges of the board, and to her surprise it came loose easily, revealing a small hidden compartment underneath. There, protected from dust by a piece of cloth, was a yellowed envelope. With trembling hands, Sarah picked it up. There was no name on the envelope, only the marks of time. Inside, she found a letter written in a hurried and irregular hand, as if it had been drafted with great urgency. "If you found this, it's because I am no longer here. My name is Emily, and like you, I was a prisoner of this house and this man. I tried to escape 3 times. The first 2 times, he found me and brought me back. What happened afterwards, I can't put into words. Now I'm planning my last attempt. There's money hidden in the barn, behind the 3rd beam to the left of the entrance. I don't know if it will still be there when you read this, but it's worth checking. Beware of the path through the forest. He knows every trail. If you can, follow the river. And remember, he always finds you. Be smarter than I was. Good luck." Sarah let the letter fall to the floor, feeling as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Emily, she had never heard Robert mention that name. How many other women had passed through that house before her? How many had tried to escape? She quickly replaced the letter in the envelope and returned it to the hiding place, adjusting the board back into position. She needed to think. The mention of money in the barn ignited a spark of hope, but the last words of the letter terrified her. "He always finds you." She looked out the window, observing the property that stretched before her. The house sat on top of a small elevation, allowing Robert to see any movement on the main road. But at the back, almost at the boundary with the neighbor's land, was the river that Emily had mentioned. She had never considered that route because the river was known for its strong current in some stretches, but perhaps it was her best chance. A familiar whinny brought her back to reality. Chestnut was in the small enclosure next to the stable. As if sensing her agitation, Sarah decided she needed to check if the money mentioned by Emily still existed. But first, she would prepare everything she could take with her. Some clothes, the few provisions she could carry, and the only photo she had of her parents. In the stable, she stroked Chestnut's strong neck, feeling momentarily reassured by the firm presence of the animal. "I discovered something today, my friend," she whispered. "It seems I'm not the first to want to escape from here, but I'll be the first to succeed, you'll see." The horse, as if understanding the gravity of her words, kept his attentive eyes on her, transmitting a silent strength that Sarah desperately needed at that moment. Carefully, she went to the 3rd beam mentioned in the letter. It was taller than the others and seemed solid to the initial touch, but when she pressed a specific point, she felt that a small part moved. Inserting her fingers into the newly discovered opening, she managed to pull out a piece of wood, revealing another secret compartment. Her heart almost stopped when she saw what was inside. A wad of bills, wrapped in plastic for protection, and a small hand-drawn map. showing escape routes from the property. Emily had thought of everything. Sarah counted the money with trembling fingers, $2,300, a small fortune for someone who, like her, had no access to any financial resources. Robert controlled every cent. That came in and went out of the property, giving her only what was necessary for the month's purchases, always accompanied by him, of course. That money meant possibilities she had not dared to dream of for a long time. She examined the map, drawn by Emily, recognizing the main points of the region. There were 3 routes marked, one along the main road, crossed out with a red X, another through the forest, marked with question marks, and the third following the course of the river, with a circle around it. Emily clearly considered the river as the best option, and after the warning in the letter, Sarah agreed. "Miss Emily, I don't even know who you were, but thank you," she whispered, carefully storing the money and the map in the inner pocket of her jacket. Back at the house, Sarah began to gather the essentials for her escape, a small backpack, which could be easily carried during the ride with Chestnut, practical clothes, a canteen for water, and the old compass her father had given her when she was a child. She hid everything under the floorboard, in the same place, where she had found Emily's letter. In the afternoon, she prepared a simple dinner and sat at the table alone, something rare when Robert was home. She ate slowly, savoring the silence. This could be her last meal in that kitchen, where so many tears had been shed. As she washed the dishes, her thoughts wandered to her brother. Michael. If she could reach him, she would have a safe place to stay, at least temporarily. The problem was that Robert would probably look for her there first. She needed a more elaborate plan. That's when she remembered Jessica, her best friend from adolescence before Robert entered her life. They had lost contact after her marriage, another consequence of the isolation he had imposed, but the last. She knew Jessica was living in Denver. It was a city big enough to get lost in, to start over. If she could get there. A sudden noise from outside made her jump. She quickly dried her hands and ran to the window, her heart pounding against her chest. She breathed a sigh of relief when she saw it was just a branch that had fallen due to the strong wind that was starting to blow. But the scare was a cruel reminder of her constant state of alertness. Sarah decided she would leave in the early morning of the following day, not the next night, as she had initially planned. Something in Emily's letter had left her with a bad feeling. What if Robert returned earlier? What if somehow he suspected her plans? "No," she said aloud to the empty house. "I can't wait even one more day." With the decision made, she felt a mixture of adrenaline and terror taking over her body. She needed to prepare better, anticipate any problems that might arise. She returned to the stable to check Chestnut's saddle and ensure it was in good condition. The horse greeted her with a soft whinny, approaching the bars so she could touch him. "We need to be ready, friend," she whispered, stroking his muzzle. "Tomorrow, before the sun rises, we'll leave this place." Chestnut snorted, as if in agreement. Sarah smiled, grateful to have at least one ally in the uncertain journey she was about to begin. Back at the house, she prepared for bed, even knowing that sleep would hardly come. Lying in the bed she shared with Robert, she felt a shiver run down her spine. How many nights of horror had she lived in that same room? How many times had she silently begged for time to pass more quickly, for that torment to end? The hours passed slowly as she stared at the ceiling, mentally reviewing every detail of her plan. She knew she would have only one chance. If she failed, if Robert found her, thunder echoed in the distance, announcing the approach of a storm. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Storms always made her nervous, a reflex of the times when, as a child, she would hide under the covers during nights of heavy rain. Now, however, the bad weather could be an ally, erasing her tracks more quickly. She got up and went to the window, watching the dark clouds approaching. The rain began to fall, first in spaced drops, then transforming into a constant downpour. The property, occasionally illuminated by lightning, seemed even more isolated and gloomy. "Better this way," she murmured, resting her forehead against the cold glass. "No one in their right mind would go out in this weather." It was then that, She saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Headlights of a car approaching along the dirt road, now transformed into mud due to the rain. Robert couldn't be returning, not so soon, unless he had never really gone to town, unless it was all a test like so many other times. With her heart racing, Sarah ran back to the bed, pretending to sleep. She heard the front door open with a familiar creak, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor. Robert was home, and much earlier than expected. "Sarah!" His voice thundered through the house, louder than the storm outside. "Where are you?" She took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in her voice before responding. "Here in the bedroom, Robert. I was sleeping." The footsteps approached, getting heavier, until the bedroom door opened with a crash. Robert entered the bedroom, his silhouette filling the doorway. The strong smell of whiskey and cigarettes invaded the room, making Sarah instinctively shrink back. "Surprised to see me?" he asked, his slurred voice betraying his drunkenness. "I thought you wouldn't be back until tomorrow," she responded, cautiously sitting up in bed. "Did something happen?" Robert threw his wet hat onto the dresser, spreading water droplets across the antique furniture. He ran his hand through his damp hair and let out a dry laugh. "Roads are hell with this rain. Decided to come back before it got worse." He stared at her, eyes half closed. "Why? Did that mess up your plans?" Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins. Did he know? Had he somehow discovered her intention to escape? "What plans? I was just fulfilling my obligations as always," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Robert approached, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank under his weight, causing Sarah to involuntarily slide toward him. "You know what's funny?" he continued, as if he hadn't heard her response. "I ran into your little brother in town today. He was at the bar talking loudly about how worried he was about you, about how I keep you isolated." He paused, his eyes fixed on her. "Interesting, isn't it? How he thinks he knows what happens in my house." Sarah swallowed hard. Michael had always been overly protective, and now his concerns could have complicated her situation even further. "He doesn't understand our life, Robert. You know how Michael is." "No, Sarah," he interrupted, leaning closer. "I'm the one who doesn't understand. How does your brother have so many opinions about our life if, as you say, you never tell him anything?" The air in the room seemed thin, and Sarah struggled to breathe normally. Every word was a trap, and she knew she needed to choose hers with extreme caution. "He's always been like that, overprotective. Since we were children, he imagines things." Robert continued to stare at her for a long moment before getting up abruptly. He walked to the window and stood watching the rain falling in torrents. "I found your brother, but I couldn't resolve the business," he said, abruptly changing the subject. "I'll have to go back to town early tomorrow. And this time, you're coming with me." Sarah's heart raced. Going to town meant a chance to escape, to ask for help, but it also meant being under Robert's watchful eye the entire time. "All right," she agreed, trying not to show any particular emotion. Robert turned, a strange smile on his lips. "Of course it's all right. You're an obedient wife, aren't you?" "Sarah?" There was something in his tone that made her shudder. He approached again, this time stopping right in front of her. "Stand up," he ordered suddenly. Sarah obeyed, confused by the change in behavior. "Turn around," he commanded, and again she complied, now with her back to him, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Robert placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch heavy and intimidating as always. He leaned in and whispered in her ear, "I know you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Before she could respond, he released her and left the room, leaving her trembling in the middle of the dark room. The sound of the front door slamming indicated that he had gone out again, probably to the stable or to the barn, where he usually went when he was particularly disturbed. Sarah collapsed on the bed, her legs too weak to support her. Her plan was crumbling before it even began. Robert suspected something, and the trip to town the next day would make her escape in the early morning impossible. She looked at the window, watching the merciless rain that lashed the property. Perhaps it was a sign. Perhaps she should give up. Perhaps Emily was right and there was no escape from that place, from that man. But then, Like a flash cutting through the darkness, she remembered the hidden money, the map, the determination she had felt just a few hours before. She couldn't give up now, she just needed to adapt her plan. She got up and went to the window, straining her eyes against the darkness. Robert had left the car parked in front of the house. The keys, as always, would be in his pants pocket or on the hook near the door. She had never considered using the car to escape. It would be the first place he would look. But now, with the trip to town scheduled for the next day, she might have a chance. If she could convince him to let her drive at some point on a stretch of road, she could simply accelerate and leave. Or perhaps while they were in town, she could find a moment to escape, to seek help. Lightning illuminated the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering how she used to count the seconds between lightning and thunder as a child, to know how close the storm was. Now the storm wasn't just nearby, it was directly above her. Outside, she heard Chestnut's agitated whinny. The horse had never liked storms and was probably restless in his stable. Robert must be there trying to calm him. Or maybe not. Maybe he was just watching, waiting for the animal to quiet down on its own. Robert had never had much patience for what he considered nonsense. Sarah returned to the bed and sat down, her mind working frantically. She needed a new plan, and fast. Tomorrow morning they would be on their way to town, and if she didn't take advantage of this opportunity, she might never have another. She remembered then something she had read once. Sometimes the safest place is right under the predator's nose. The town. Robert would never imagine that she would try to escape in such a public, exposed place. He had always believed she was too afraid for that, and he was right. She was afraid. But now she also had something she never had before. A concrete plan and resources to execute it. Morning arrived with the persistent humidity of the night storm. The sky, previously loaded with dark clouds, now displayed a timid blue between sparse mists. Sarah had spent the night practically awake, refining her new plan. The money and the small map were now carefully hidden in the inner seam of her coat, a hasty modification she had made in the dead of night. Robert was already up, moving around the house with his usual impatience. Sarah prepared breakfast in silence, avoiding any prolonged eye contact. The less attention she drew, the better. "Be ready in half an hour," he ordered, swallowing the last gulp of coffee. "I don't want to be late because of you." Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes lowered. "I'll just finish tidying the kitchen." Robert went out to check the car, and she took the opportunity to breathe deeply, trying to calm her nerves. The town. After so long isolated on that property, she would finally be in a place with other people, with potential witnesses. The thought was both frightening and comforting. Once the kitchen tasks were finished, she put on her best dress, a simple navy blue model she rarely wore. Robert raised an eyebrow when he saw her, a mixture of suspicion and surprise in his eyes. "Why are you so dressed up?" he questioned, his tone harsh. "You always complain when I don't dress up to go out," she responded, keeping her voice neutral. "I thought you'd be pleased." He examined her for a moment, as if looking for signs of lies in her posture, in her face. Finally, he limited himself to muttering something unintelligible and pointed to the door. "Let's go." The journey to town would take about an hour. The road, still muddy from the previous night's rain, demanded Robert's heightened attention at the wheel. Sarah observed the landscape through the window, trying to memorize every detail, every curve. If she needed to return alone, by any means, she would need to know the way. A few miles after leaving the property, they passed a rusty sign indicating Pine Creek, 29 miles. It was the nearest town, small but big enough to have a bus station from which she could catch a bus to Denver, where Jessica, her old friend, lived. "What are you thinking about?" Robert suddenly asked, breaking the silence that had settled. Sarah, startled, quickly returning to reality. "Nothing important, just, it's been a while since I went to town." "And you won't be doing anything other than accompanying me," he replied, his tone making it clear that it wasn't a suggestion. "I have business to take care of at the bank and with the lawyer about that part of the land. You'll wait in the Canasiers." Sarah nodded, containing her disappointment. Staying in the car would make her plan more difficult, but not impossible. She would need to be patient, wait for the right opportunity. As they approached Pine Creek, the road became smoother, and the first houses began to appear. For someone used to large centers, this would be just a small country town. For Sarah, after so much isolation, it was like entering a completely new world. The center of town consisted basically of a main street, with shops and commercial establishments on both sides, and some perpendicular streets where residences and less sought-after services were concentrated. A central square with a modest church served as a meeting point for local residents. Robert parked the car in front of the town's only bank. "I'll be about 20 minutes, he said, turning off the engine. "Then I need to stop by Mr. Peterson's office to sign some documents. Don't leave here." With that, he left Sarah alone in the car, the keys safely in his pants pocket. She watched as he entered the bank, his imposing figure disappearing behind the glass doors. 20 minutes. It wasn't enough time to execute her escape plan, but maybe it was enough to reconnaissance. Identify escape routes for later. Taking a deep breath, she opened the car door and got out. The air in town, even being a small locality, seemed lighter, less oppressive than that of the farm. Sarah looked around, absorbing every detail. The bus station, her main objective, was a few blocks away according to an indicator sign. Near the bank, there was a small diner, a pharmacy, and a clothing store. Decision made, Sarah crossed the street toward the pharmacy. She needed some basic items, painkillers, bandages, anything that might be useful during her escape. Using a small part of Emily's money, she made quick purchases, exchanging few words with the attendant. As she left the pharmacy, her eyes found a public clock in the square. 15 minutes had passed since Robert had left her. She needed to get back to the car before he returned and discovered her small disobedience. That's when she spotted across the street a familiar figure, tall, with the same brown eyes as hers. Michael was coming out of a hardware store. Her brother. Her heart accelerated with a mixture of joy and fear. If she could talk to him, explain her situation. But Robert could also see him at any moment. The decision needed to be quick. Return to the car and wait for a better opportunity, or risk everything now, in the hope that Michael could help. Her escape immediately. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief second, gathering courage. When she opened them again, there was determination in her gaze. It was now or never. Sarah crossed the street quickly, her heart hammering against her chest. Michael had his back to her, organizing packages in the trunk of his old blue Chevy. She looked nervously toward the bank. There was still no sign of Robert. "Michael," she called softly, when she was close enough. Her brother turned, his face initially confused, then lighting up with a smile that quickly gave way to concern upon noticing Sarah's tense expression. "Sarah, what a surprise to see you here," he said, hugging her briefly. He stepped back to examine her better, his hands gently holding her shoulders. "Is everything okay? You look—" "I don't have much time," she interrupted, her voice trembling with urgency. "Robert is in the bank. He'll be out any moment." Michael's expression hardened at the mention of his brother-in-law's name. There was something in his eyes that Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of contained anger and determination. Yesterday he was saying that he keeps you isolated for your own safety, that you're unstable, said Michael, carefully choosing his words. "But I didn't believe a word. I haven't seen you in months, Sarah. What's really happening?" Sarah felt tears forming, but she held them back. There was no time for emotions now. "I need your help, Michael. I need to get out of that house. He's not who you think." Michael nodded gravely as if he already suspected. "I've suspected for a long time. The way he isolates you, the excuses for you never being able to visit us." He paused, hesitant. "Sarah, does he hurt you?" She couldn't respond with words, but her silence and downcast gaze said everything. Michael clenched his fists, a wave of fury passing across his face. "I'll end him," he muttered, looking toward the bank. "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "That would only make things worse. I need you to help me escape. I have a plan, but I need time." Michael took a deep breath, visibly trying to control himself. "What do you need me to do?" Robert is going to Mr. Peterson's office after the bank. I need you to meet me at the bus station in an hour. I'll try to convince him to let me take a walk while he takes care of his business. And if he doesn't let you, then I'll find another way, but I'll be there, Michael. Please wait for me. Her brother nodded, determined. I'll be there, and Sarah. He held her hands. This time I won't let you go back to that place. I promise. A movement at the entrance to the bank caught Sarah's attention. It was Robert, looking both ways, down the street, searching for her. I have to go, she said quickly, releasing herself from her brother's hands. 1 hour at the bus station. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked hurriedly toward the car, trying to appear casual. She saw out of the corner of her eye that Robert had finally spotted her and was walking in her direction, his face contorted in a furious expression. "Where were you?" he demanded, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave marks. "I told you to stay in the car." "I just went to buy some medicine for a headache," Sarah responded, showing the small bag from the pharmacy. "It was too hot inside the car." Robert looked at the bag, then at her, distrust evident in his gaze. For a terrible moment, Sarah feared he had seen her meeting with Michael. "Next time, ask me first," he said finally. "Come on, I have to stop by Peterson's office now." Hugger. They walked back to the car. Sarah resisted the urge to look back, where she knew Michael would still be watching. A strange sensation of relief mixed with fear took hold of her. For the first time in years, she was no longer alone in her struggle. At the lawyer's office, Robert was received immediately and led to an inner room. Sarah stayed in the small waiting room, watching the clock on the wall. Each minute that passed was a minute closer to her freedom. "Would you like some coffee, ma'am?" offered the secretary, a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile. "Yes, thank you," Sarah responded, surprised by her own voice. It seemed firmer now, more determined. As she drank the coffee, an idea began to form in her mind. The office had a side door, probably an emergency exit. If she could distract the secretary for long enough— "Excuse me," called Sarah, approaching the counter. "Could I use the restroom?" "Of course, it's the last door on the right down the hallway," the woman indicated, returning her attention to the computer afterward. Sarah walked down the corridor, passing the bathroom and continuing until she found the side door. It was unlocked, as she had hoped. Outside, she saw it led to a narrow alley that, if followed to the end, would probably take her to a parallel street. Back in the waiting room, she sat down again, now with a more concrete plan. When Robert came out of the meeting, she would ask to take a walk around town while he finished his business. If he denied, as was likely, she would use the side exit as soon as she had a chance. Time was running out, and she wouldn't miss this opportunity. The door to the inner room opened, and Robert came out accompanied by Mr. Peterson, a short, bald man who was talking animatedly about the details of the transaction. They had just closed. Sarah stood up, nervously adjusting her dress. "Ready to go?" asked Robert, barely looking at her. "Actually," Sarah began, gathering all her courage, "I thought about taking a walk around the square while you finish your business. It's been so long since I've been to town." Robert narrowed his eyes, suspicion immediately present in his gaze. But before he could respond, Mr. Peterson intervened. "Great idea. The day is lovely and our square is charming. Robert, we still need to review those other documents I mentioned. Why not let your wife enjoy the town a bit while we do that? Here it shouldn't take more than an hour." Robert's face transformed into a mask of control, a forced smile for the lawyer, but eyes that promised consequences for Sarah. She knew that look well. "Sure, why not?" he replied, his voice falsely friendly. Then, turning to Sarah, he added in a lower tone, "1 hour, not a minute more. And stay where I can find you easily." Sarah nodded, trying to appear casual despite her racing heart. "I'll be in the square or in the shops around it." With that, she left the office, feeling Robert's gaze burning into her back. As soon as she turned the corner, she allowed herself a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. 1 hour. She had exactly 1 hour to reach the bus station, find Michael, and begin her escape. The central square was relatively busy for a weekday. Some elderly people occupied the benches, talking quietly, while mothers watched their children play in the small park. Sarah crossed the space quickly, constantly looking behind her, fearing to see Robert following her. The bus station was about a 15-minute walk from the square. It wasn't a long distance, but each step took her further from the relative safety of the town center, where there would be witnesses if Robert tried something. Still, there was no choice. Adjusting the bag where she had stored the few purchases from the pharmacy, she began walking toward the bus station, maintaining a quick pace without drawing attention. As she moved away from the center, the streets became emptier. The feeling of exposure grew with each block, and Sarah couldn't help but look nervously over her shoulder every few steps. Fear, her constant companion over the years, now took on new dimensions. It was no longer the fear of what Robert might do, but the fear of not being able to escape him. Finally, turning a corner, she spotted the small bus terminal of Pine Creek. It was a simple construction with a few covered platforms and a modest waiting room. To Sarah, at that moment, it seemed like the gateway to freedom. She entered quickly, her eyes scanning the environment for Michael. She didn't find him immediately, which made her stomach sink. Had he given up? Or perhaps he had misunderstood the agreed-upon time? "Can I help you, ma'am?" asked the attendant at the only ticket window, noticing her distressed expression. I'm waiting for someone," Sarah responded, trying to appear calm. The man nodded, disinterested, and returned his attention to the newspaper he was reading. Sarah walked to one of the waiting benches and sat down, her eyes fixed on the entrance. She checked the clock on the wall. 20 minutes had passed since she left the lawyer's office, 40 minutes remaining. The minutes dragged on painfully. Each person who entered the terminal made her heart race, only to sink again when she realized it wasn't Michael. Her foot tapped nervously against the floor, a physical manifestation of her growing anxiety. 30 minutes since she left the office. Michael still hadn't arrived. Sarah began to consider the possibility that she would have to flee alone. She approached the ticket window again. "Excuse me, when does the next bus to Denver leave?" she asked. The attendant consulted the computer. "In an hour and 40 minutes, ma'am. Would you like to buy a ticket?" Sarah hesitated. If she bought the ticket now and Michael didn't show up, she would have to wait almost 2 hours at the terminal. Enough time for Robert to finish his meeting, not find her in the square, and start frantically searching for her around town. "I'll think about it a bit more, thank you," she replied, returning to her seat. It was then that the door opened and Michael finally entered the terminal. Sarah almost collapsed with relief upon seeing him. She quickly stood up and ran toward him. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, her voice trembling. "Sorry for the delay," he replied, hugging her briefly. "I had to throw Robert off. He was looking for you around town." Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins. "What do you mean? He was supposed to be in the lawyer's office." "Apparently, he finished earlier than expected. He didn't find you in the square and started asking about you in the shops around. Then I don't know how he heard someone comment that they saw me in town and started looking for me too." "Does he know?" asked Sarah, panic growing in her voice. "I'm not sure, but we can't stay here. If he's looking for us, this will be one of the first places he'll check." Sarah nodded, her mind working quickly. "Where do we go then?" "I have a friend about 60 miles from here in White Ridge. We can stay there for a few days until we decide on the next step. My car is parked 2 blocks from here, on a side street." They quickly left the terminal, opting for a less visible side exit. Michael led the way while Sarah constantly looked back, expecting to see Robert's imposing figure at any moment. The rain, which had given a respite during the morning, was starting to fall again, fine and insistent. In a few minutes they were soaked, but neither of them slowed down. "There," said Michael, pointing to the old blue Chevy parked under a tree. "Let's get out of here." As they approached the car, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. Her instinct, honed by years of hypervigilance, screamed in alert. "Michael, wait," she whispered, holding her brother's arm. Too late. The driver's door of the Chevy opened, and Robert emerged, like a figure out of a nightmare. His face was contorted in a fury Sarah had never seen before, not even in the worst moments. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Is this how you thank me for everything I've done for you, Sarah? Running away with your good-for-nothing brother? Michael instinctively placed himself in front of Sarah, shielding her with his body. It's over, Robert. She's coming with me, and you'll never lay a finger on her again. Robert laughed, a cold sound without humor. Is that so? And who's going to stop me? You? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The rain intensified, the heavy drops creating a translucent curtain around the three. On the deserted street, the only sound besides the water hitting the asphalt was Robert's heavy breathing. Sarah, get in the car, ordered Robert, taking a step forward. We're going home and forgetting this absurd incident. Michael remained, firm, blocking the path. She's not going anywhere with you. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Sarah, paralyzed by fear, observed the two men facing each other like predators about to attack. She knew Robert too well not to recognize the signs, the vein pulsing in his temple, his clenched fists, his slightly forward-leaning posture. He was about to lose control. "Michael," she called softly, pulling on the sleeve of his shirt. "Let's go, please." "Listen to your sister," mocked Robert. "She knows what's best for her." "What's best for her is to be far away from you," retorted Michael, his voice rising. "You think we don't know what you do to her? The marks on her arms, the fear. In her eyes? It's over, Robert. You'll never hurt her again." Robert's face darkened, and for a terrible moment, Sarah thought he would attack Michael right there. Instead, he took another step forward, his voice dangerously calm. "Sarah is my wife. What happens between us is our business, and you," he pointed at Michael, "are meddling where you're not wanted." Michael laughed without humor. "Typical of abusers like you. Isolate the victim, separate her from her family, make her believe that no one else cares. Well, I have news for you. We do care, and we won't allow this anymore." The mention of the word abuser seemed to ignite something in Robert. His face contorted in pure fury, and he quickly advanced, grabbing Michael by the collar of his shirt and pushing him against the car. "Say that again, you punk!" he shouted, shaking Michael violently. Sarah screamed, running to separate the two. "Stop. Robert, let him go." Michael reacted, pushing Robert with enough force to make him stagger backwards. For a moment, the two men measured each other, panting, the rain streaming down their tense faces. "Sarah," said Michael, without taking his eyes off Robert, "take the keys from my pocket and get in the car." She hesitated, fearing what might happen if she left the two alone, but Michael insisted. "Now, Sarah." With trembling fingers, she took the keys from Michael's pants pocket and opened the passenger door. Robert, perceiving her intention, tried to reach her, but Michael intercepted, him blocking his path. "You don't understand," shouted Robert, trying to get around Michael. "She needs me. She doesn't know how to live without me." Those words, so often whispered in her ear during the years of abuse, now sounded empty and pathetic to Sarah's ears. The fog of fear that always enveloped her when Robert was nearby was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a clarity she hadn't felt in years. "You're wrong, Robert," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I survived you for all these years. Now I'm going to learn to live without you." Something in Robert's face changed. The fury gave way to an expression Sarah had never seen before: desperation. "You can't leave me," he said, almost pleadingly. "What will I do without you?" The question, so selfish in its essence, was perfectly Robert. Even at the moment he was losing the control he exerted over her. His concern was for himself. "That's not my problem anymore," Sarah replied, getting into the car and closing the door. Robert looked at her through the window, the rain distorting his image. For a moment it seemed he would accept defeat. Then in a sudden movement he lunged at Michael, catching him off guard. The two men fell onto the wet asphalt, a confusion of arms and legs as they fought for control. Sarah got out of the car, screaming for them to stop, but her words were swallowed by the noise of the rain and the cars that were beginning to pass by on the street, some drivers slowing down to observe the fight. Robert managed to get on top, his fist raised ready to hit Michael. That's when a police cruiser rounded the corner, siren on. Someone, probably one of the passing drivers, had called the authorities. Robert hesitated, his fist still in the air. The arrival of the police seemed to have brought him back to reality, reminding him of his position in the community, of his carefully constructed reputation. Two officers got out of the cruiser, approaching quickly. "What's going on here?" asked the older one, his hand preventively resting on the gun at his waist. Robert slowly got up, adjusting his soaked clothes. His face instantly assumed the expression of offended dignity he usually used in public. "Just a family disagreement, officer," he responded, his voice controlled. "My brother-in-law and I had a small disagreement about a personal matter. Michael got up too, wiping blood from a cut on his lip. He's lying," he said, pointing at Robert. "This man has been abusing my sister for years. We were helping her escape from him." The younger officer looked at Sarah, who remained next to the car, soaked and trembling, from cold, from fear, from adrenaline. "Ma'am?" he asked, cautiously approaching. "Is this true?" Sarah felt the weight of Robert's gaze on her. For so many years she had lived under that gaze, molding her behavior to avoid his wrath. Now she faced a choice: continue in the pattern of submission she knew, or take the final step toward freedom. Taking a deep breath, she found her voice. "Yes, officer," she replied, looking directly into the officer's eyes. "It's true." The Pine Creek police station was a small and modest building, like everything in town. Painted a faded yellow, it had only 3 rooms besides the reception: the sheriff's office, an interview room, and a temporary cell where rarely anyone stayed for more than one night. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, a cup of lukewarm tea between her hands. They had offered her a towel and dry clothes, the latter coming from the home of the clerk, who lived near the station. The blue dress, now damp and wrinkled, was carefully folded on her lap. On the other side of the station, in separate rooms, Robert and Michael were giving their statements. It was the station's policy to keep the involved parties apart while gathering the facts, explained the clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a maternal air. "Mrs. Miller?" called Sheriff Wilson, coming out of his office. "We can talk now." Sarah nodded, rising with still trembling legs. The sheriff, a man in his 50s with a graying mustache and a tired expression, indicated the interview room. "This way, please." The room was simple: a table, 3 chairs, a ceiling fan that turned slowly. On the wall, a wooden crucifix and the official portrait of the president. There was also a small window that looked out onto the station's parking lot, where Sarah could see the police car and, further away, Michael's blue Chevy. "Please, sit." "Down," said the sheriff, indicating one of the chairs. "I'm Sheriff Wilson. I want to clarify that this is an informal conversation for now. I'm trying to understand what happened today." Sarah sat down, holding the folded dress tightly as if it were a shield. "Your brother made serious accusations against your husband," continued the sheriff, his voice neutral and professional. "He said you suffer domestic violence. Is that true?" Sarah felt her throat tighten. It was the first time someone in a position of authority had directly asked her this question. For a moment, the old fear emerged. The fear of not being believed, of appearing crazy, of angering Robert, even more. But then she remembered Emily's letter, the hidden money, the hand-drawn map. Other women had gone through the same hell and tried to escape. Some, like Emily, possibly hadn't succeeded. This was her chance to break the cycle. "Yes, Sheriff," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It's true." The sheriff nodded gravely, making some notes on a pad. "How long has this been happening?" "Since the beginning of our marriage 12 years ago. At first it was just words, control, isolation. Then he started to physically assault me." "Have you ever reported it before?" Sarah shook her head. He always said that no one would believe me, that everyone in town respects him, that they would see me as an unstable woman." The sheriff sighed, as if he had heard similar stories before. "Mrs. Miller, I need you to be specific. Can you tell me about the last incident of assault before today?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. There were so many incidents, so many moments of terror. that they blended in her memory like a dark, continuous stain. "The night before last," she began, her eyes still closed, "Robert came home drunk. I had forgotten to put a tool away in the barn, and he was furious. He slammed my head against the kitchen wall." She opened her eyes and pushed back her hair, showing a bruise still visible on her temple. "There's more," she continued, suddenly determined not to hide anything. She rolled up the sleeves of the borrowed blouse, revealing purple marks in different stages of healing on both arms. "These are from when he held me forcefully 3 days ago, and these," she pointed to older, now yellowish marks, "are from last week." The sheriff observed the marks in silence, his face remaining professional, but his eyes betraying a flash of compassion. "Mrs. Miller, I'll need you to undergo a medical examination to document these injuries. I'd also like to formally register your complaint. Are you willing to do that?" Sarah hesitated. A formal complaint would mean a point of no return. Robert would never forgive her, not that it mattered now. But there was still fear, still doubt. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "Depending on the evidence and your formal testimony, he could face charges of battery, threats, perhaps even false imprisonment, from what your brother mentioned about forced isolation. But at this moment, our priority is to ensure your safety. And if I don't want to file the complaint now?" The sheriff adjusted himself in his chair, carefully choosing his words. "That's your right. No one can force you. But I need to be honest. Without a formal complaint, my options are limited. I can keep him detained for a few hours for the fight in the street, but eventually, I'll have to release him." Sarah felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. For years, she had lived imprisoned not only by Robert's actions, but also by her own fear. Now she had the chance to break both chains. "I'll file the complaint," she finally said, her voice firmer, "and I'll do the examination. I want this to end once and for all." A slight smile of approval appeared on the sheriff's face. "Excellent decision, Mrs. Miller. I'll ask the clerk to prepare the necessary documents." He rose to leave but stopped at the door when Sarah called. "Sheriff, there's one more thing you should know." He turned, expectant. "On the farm, I found a letter, hidden under the floorboards. It was written by a woman named Emily. She also tried to escape from Robert. In the letter, she said he always found her. I don't know what happened to her, but..." The sheriff's expression subtly changed, a shadow of recognition passing through his eyes. "Emily Crawford," he said, almost to himself, "disappeared about 8 years ago. She was Robert's first wife. He said she had run off with another man." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The letter said it was her third escape attempt, that in the first 2 he found her and brought her back. Sheriff Wilson returned to the table, sitting down again. "Mrs. Miller, I'm going to need that letter, and if you don't mind, I'd like to hear more about this after we register your formal complaint." When the sheriff left the room, Sarah remained seated, looking through the small window at the rain that continued to fall outside. A strange sensation was beginning to take hold of her, something between relief and fear, between liberation and vertigo. For the first time in 12 years, she dared to think of the future as something more than just survival. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon in Pine Creek. Autumn was giving its last gasps, giving way to a mild winter typical of the southern states. Sarah observed the landscape through the window of the small house she now shared with Michael on the outskirts of Denver. The trees, almost stripped of their leaves, swayed gently with the morning breeze. "More coffee?" asked Jessica, her old friend from adolescence, now rediscovered, and a fundamental part of her new life. "Please," answered Sarah, extending her cup. Jessica filled it with the steaming liquid, sitting down at the kitchen table afterward. "How was your session with Dr. Reynolds yesterday?" Sarah smiled slightly. The therapy sessions, initially so uncomfortable and painful, had become a pillar of her recovery. "It was good. We're working on trust issues. It's still difficult. You know, believing that I deserve good things." Jessica nodded understandingly, reaching for Sarah's hand on the table. "You deserve everything good, friend. And this is just the beginning." Jessica's words echoed a truth that Sarah still struggled to fully internalize. The past months had been a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. After filing the formal complaint against Robert, a series of events unfolded with surprising rapidity. Emily's letter, turned over to the authorities, reopened an investigation into her disappearance. With a search warrant, the police found, buried near the barn on the farm, the body of a woman who was later identified as Emily Crawford. Robert was placed in preventive detention, awaiting trial not only for the assaults against Sarah, but also for the murder of his first wife. "Did Michael call?" asked Jessica, bringing Sarah back to the present. "Yes, last night. He's enjoying his new job at the construction company, and he said he'll come for dinner with us on Sunday." The relationship with her brother had strengthened immensely in the past months. After everything that had happened, Michael insisted that Sarah stay with him until she got established. At first she resisted. Years of conditioning made it difficult to accept help without feeling like a burden. But gradually, with the support of therapy, she began to understand that true family meant mutual support, not control and submission. "And what about the course?" asked Jessica, getting up to prepare some toast. "Have you decided if you're going to enroll?" Sarah smiled, a genuine sparkle of enthusiasm in her eyes. "Yes, I am. Registration opens next week. If all goes well, I'll start the nursing assistant program next semester." It was an old dream, abandoned when she met Robert. At the time, he had convinced her that studying was a waste of time, that her place was taking care of the house. Now, at 38, Sarah was rediscovering dreams she thought were lost forever. "I'll be rooting for you," said Jessica, placing the toast on the table along with homemade jam. "You'll be an amazing nurse." After breakfast, Sarah prepared to go out. She had a job interview at a small bookstore downtown. Nothing grandiose, but it would be her first paid job in more than a decade. Financial independence, however small, initially represented another crucial step in her journey of rebuilding. Before leaving, she stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway. The woman who stared back was different from the one who had lived so many years in constant fear. Her face was fuller with a bit more color. Her eyes, previously always lowered and vigilant, now looked at the world with renewed curiosity. She wasn't completely healed, perhaps she never would be, but she was moving forward. "You'll be late," warned Jessica, handing her the purse. "I'm going. Thank you for everything, Jess." "No need to thank me. That's what friends are for." On the street, the day was surprisingly sunny for that time of year. Sarah walked to the bus stop, observing the life unfolding around her. Children going to school, elderly people walking their dogs, merchants opening their stores. The everyday normality that for so long had seemed unattainable now enveloped her. On the bus, she opened her purse to check the documents she would take to the interview. Among them, she found a photo she didn't remember putting there. It was an old image faded by time, herself at 15, mounted on Chestnut, smiling with the carefree attitude of youth. On the back, in Jessica's handwriting, a message, to remember that you were always free inside. Her eyes watered as she stared at the photograph. Chestnut. During the chaos that followed Robert's arrest, the horse's fate had been temporarily forgotten. It was only weeks later, when the legal issues began to be resolved, that Sarah learned that the farm would be sold as part of the judicial process, and all assets, including the animals, would be liquidated. In an action that surprised everyone, Sarah used part of the money found in Emily's hiding place, returned to her by the authorities after the necessary documentation, to buy Chestnut at the public auction. The horse was now at a small ranch on the outskirts of Denver, belonging to a friend of Michael's, who had offered shelter to the animal in exchange for occasional help with other horses. Every Sunday, Sarah visited Chestnut. In the first encounters, the animal seemed as traumatized as she was, distrustful, hesitant. Gradually, both recovered together. Now, after 6 months, their meetings were marked by long walks through the fields, moments of silent communion that healed invisible wounds. The bus stopped, announcing downtown. Sarah carefully put away the photo and got off, adjusting the simple blazer she had bought especially for the interview. The bookstore building was 2 blocks away. As she walked, she thought about everything she had experienced, everything she had lost, and everything she was now, finally, beginning to reclaim. At the door of the bookstore, she took a deep breath before entering. It was just one more step in a long journey, but each step took her farther from the past and closer to the future she now dared to imagine for herself. A future where she was not just a survivor, but a complete woman, sweet from her own self and bitter from her being, as the verses of the old song her mother used to hum said. Before opening the door, she looked at the clear winter sky and smiled. Emily, wherever she was, might also be smiling. Her frustrated escape attempt, the letter left behind, had been fundamental for Sarah to find her own path to freedom. Now, it remained to honor that invisible legacy, living fully the life that had almost been stolen from her. "Are you ready, ma'am?" asked an employee, holding the door open for her. Sarah smiled, entering the bookstore with firm steps. "Yes," she replied, with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul. "I'm ready."